We produce enough oil in this country right now, and oil actually is at a very is very very cost very little right now because there is an actually overproduction of oil. What's happening here is you have someone like Donald Trump who like literally lives, I think, in the 1980s, in his brain, and he thinks that the best thing I could do is get a hold of oil, and that makes us a strong country. And you have someone like Marco Rubio who doesn't believe that, but knows that he could use that to his advantage to like, repay whatever crimes he thought have occurred since, Fidel Castro took over Cuba. But if you talk to, our partners around the world, and I have friends from other governments, there are our friends like NATO allies, they're looking at, now do I have to figure out how to counteract and counterbalance against the United States? Because the United States is no longer not just a trusted ally. Now they could be potentially be an enemy.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening? With me, your host, Chris Hayes. Well, it's been, as I'm talking to you, a week since the United States invaded Venezuela and abducted the president there, and extracted him to bring him back to the U.S. to face criminal charges. And one of the most surreal aspects of this action is that from the president on down, the people in the administration have been very explicit that this was kind of, for lack of a better word, a smash and grab to get access to Venezuela's oil. In the beginning of this, increasing pressure put on the Maduro regime when we were blowing up boats that were accused of drug trafficking and the people on them, killing over, I think at last count, 80 people. We don't know who those folks are by and large. There's some evidence that some of them were just fishermen or people that were sort of maybe running drugs as couriers as a kind of sideline. But as all this was happening, the idea was that we were engaged in this attempt to stop drug smuggling into the U.S. And what's become pretty clear now that this has escalated into a military action against Venezuela, even though they don't concede that it is that all of this is about access to Venezuela's oil reserves. You've heard this line a lot. They have the largest oil reserves on the planet. That's a little misleading, partly because I think there's good reason to think that those are overstated by the Venezuelan government, and also because the kind of oil that's extracted tends to be more expensive, dirtier, and harder to process. All that said, it does have a huge amount of oil wealth. And Donald Trump has basically said, we're doing this so we can control their oil. Sort of nakedly, explicitly imperialistic vision. And there's two aspects of this that I think, well, there's countless aspects that are troubling, but two that have struck with me and I wanted to talk about this week. One is the fundamental violation of a basic understanding that I think a lot of people had after Iraq, and particularly in the campaigns of both 2016 and 2024, that we were done with, quote, regime change wars. Whatever you want to say about this was obviously regime change, or at least regime change at the very top. And in some senses, it may be the same regime with a different person. And also, what a strange thing to focus on in the 21st century. Oil. I mean, obviously, oil was the most important commodity of the late 19th and the duration of the 20th century. But it seems a little short-sighted to me for your imperial ambitions that oil is the thing you're focused on. But of course, Donald Trump is 79 years old. He tends to think in the terms of a 20th century person. And so I thought we should talk about this with someone who's paying close attention to this, has a lot of thoughts, and is in a position to do something about it. And that's Senator Ruben Gallego. Senator Gallego was elected to the Senate in 2024. He's serving his first term. He's a veteran of the U.S. Marines. And he's got a lot of thoughts about both foreign policy adventurism and also energy policy for the 21st century. So I got a chance to talk to Senator Ruben Gallego. Here's that conversation. Senator Gallego, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
I want to talk about a lot of stuff with you, including a lot on energy. And obviously energy is related to what has just happened in the last week here with the U.S. Abducting, extracting, black bagging the head of the Venezuelan government, Nicolas Maduro. How did you first learn about that happening?
I was actually in Puerto Rico with my family on vacation which coincidentally, obviously, was in the area that was involved in terms of this operation. And I have a 6-month-old child. And so I woke up to do a midnight, or not even midnight feeding, I think like a 3 a.m. feeding, and looked at my phone and got the word that we had just invaded Venezuela. Didn't hear about Maduro or anything like that yet, but that we had initiated an invasion of Venezuela.
What was your initial reaction once you did hear, the full details of the operation, what the intent was, what the outcome
Sure.
was?
I mean, for me, it was like, here we go again. This was like that this was like the Iraq War again. And even prior to this, I had gone on TV and after going to a couple of briefings where I said that these guys are just setting us up for war. They are lying to us right now. This is not about narco-terrorism. This is not about anything like that. The amount of defense systems and platforms they had in the Caribbean was designed for them to put things in place for them to invade at some point and do regime change. And Marco Rubio lied to our faces and said that this was not about regime change, weeks ago. And of course, I ended up being right. And I felt horrible. I felt very scared for a lot of the men and women that were in the military, because I didn't trust that this administration would be doing the right things for the right reasons and potentially put these young men and women in danger for the sake of, this man's ego. And, my position still stands.
I think people probably know that you're a U.S. veteran. You served in the Marine Corps. You're an infantryman and deployed to Iraq, I think in 2006, if I'm not mistaken. In 2005. I'm not sure. I mean, there's all kinds of service people can have, even in theaters of war. There's a huge range.
Sure.
You were really in a lot of incredibly difficult combat situations, is my understanding, and saw your battalion take casualties. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that experience, just to give some context to how you're viewing the prism through which you're viewing this.
Yeah, look, I was a young, 20-year-old Marine infantryman sent to the Western Iraq, for those that know the area, Al Anbar, Iraq, based out of an area called Haditha. My job was largely to try to, interdict insurgents, their weapons, their support systems. I spent about 7 months going door to door, house to house, searching for weapons and insurgents, and finding myself in a lot of firefights. Someone was always trying to kill me by whatever means possible: IED, VBIED, RPG, mortars, everything that got thrown at me. Unfortunately, I lost my best friend over there, and I lost 24 other Marines and sailors also, just in my company alone. And then we also still dealt with everything coming back too. You don't just go to 7 months of straight combat and come home and be normal, if there is such a thing. And I came home with the scars of war. I still live with PTSD. The men I served with still live with the consequences of the war. And the whole time I was people were trying to kill me, my friends were getting blown up, I felt and I knew that was an illegal war. It was a war of choice that was led by these men because they wanted to, exert their power. They wanted to get their oil out. They wanted to do whatever they want in the Middle East. And, these old men were going to make the decisions, and it was these young men and women that were going to end up paying the consequences. And I still see the same thing that's happening right now. And that's what, these guys all want to be, these big, leaders. They think themselves as patent. They don't realize that a lot of times when these things are happening, these operations are happening, it's a lot of very young people that are executing them, and there are consequences to this. But Donald Trump thinks of the world and the military as his play place, as his toy, and then he's got a lot of people around him that'll just whisper whatever they need to whisper into his ear to fulfill their goals. And for Marco Rubio, that's his neocon goal of ridding the world of Cuba, and what happens whoever is in the way, whatever country's in the way in the meantime. he'll try to manipulate Trump, and Trump will gladly take part in it along the way.
You just mentioned oil, and you mentioned the kind of lies that got us into Iraq, and Iraq being a war of choice, which obviously and clearly it was, and I think that's true in Venezuela. I mean, I don't know. It's obviously a choice.
Yes.
They just woke up one day and decided to do it. You were roughly the same age, and you remember during that time, the anti-war protesters would say no war for oil, and the mainstream press and the Bush administration would be like, well, no, it's not about oil, it's about democracy, and it's about connections to Al Qaeda, and it's about weapons of mass destruction, and blah 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 blah. And when all was said and done, like obviously oil was a major reason for the war.
Sure.
In the Status of Forces agreement that's negotiated as the U.S. withdraws, the most sacrosanct stipulation is U.S. access to Iraqi oil.
Right.
This is not some fabricated conspiracy theory. But what is your reaction to hearing, this time around, it's like there's no pretense.
Yeah, they're not even trying to lie.
We are taking the oil. Like,
right.
I just, what is it? What do you think? How do you think that sounds across the world, across the hemisphere, in other parts of the world? And how does it sound to your ears to say, we're just taking your oil?
Well, we sound like bullies. In a world where we need to have as many friends as possible to deal with the rising power of China, we sound like bullies. We sound like the people that are just coming to take, and then we will, without any understanding of the consequences. The other thing is, like, it's just kind of stupid at the same time, because we produce enough oil in this country right now, and oil actually is at a very costs very little right now, because there is an actually overproduction of oil. What's happening here is you have someone like Donald Trump, who like literally lives, I think, in the 1980s, in his brain, and he thinks that the best thing I could do is get a hold of oil, and that makes us a strong country. And you have someone like Marco Rubio, who doesn't believe that, but knows that he could use that to his advantage to repay whatever crimes he thought have occurred since Fidel Castro took over Cuba. But if you talk to our partners around the world, and I have friends from other governments, there are our friends like NATO allies, they're looking at, now do I have to figure out how to counteract and counterbalance against the United States? Because the United States is no longer not just a trusted ally. Now they could be potentially be an enemy. And look how we're already talking about places like Greenland. So there's no consistency. There's no thought about this. This is just a power play. And at the end of the day, the only person it's designed to help is Donald Trump. The people that ends up hurting are us. The U.S. citizen, the people that serve in the military, because this man just cares about his personal ego and not about this country's national security.
It was really striking to me that after, this sort of declaring this kind of nakedly imperial ambition here, which is we're doing it so that we could run the country and get their oil. And again, I'm not like, it's not a caricature. Yeah. It's basically close to a direct
They're
quote.
even saying now the way we're going to run the country is by limiting who can they sell oil to.
Yes, that's the mechanism that the indirect mechanism of coercion is we're going to control their oil exports, and that will allow us to sort of rule the country. And after saying all this, then there's a wave of stories that say, well, the oil industry needs new production like they need a hole in the head right now, to your point.
Right. Correct.
It's the commodity is
oil is at $57 a barrel right now.
It's like, great. A bunch of new oil, great. And second of all, there's a bunch of technical reasons having to do with both the heavy sour form of oil that's extracted from Venezuela, the disrepair of the infrastructure there, the geopolitical uncertainty, that there's not widespread enthusiasm among the oil companies to actually go in. And so we've ended up now, this is an amazing thing to me, Trump talking about subsidizing. So what started is him saying, like, this is a sort of smash and grab for the oil.
Right.
Now we're we're on the hook as the American taxpayer to pay the oil companies to go into Venezuela.
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. I mean, look, right now when people are hurting, when energy costs are high, except for gasoline, but you can't afford a house, can't afford rent, we have the largest amount of car loan defaults right now, large amount of credit card defaults right now. The last thing the American public wants is to see the United States government giving money to billion dollar oil companies in order for them to go and build in a different country that is not necessarily going to benefit us. And so this is all entirely like lunatic position that this president is taking. And also the American people does not want to see their sons and daughters get shot up for big oil. And I think big oil also understands that, like, we don't need it. It's hard for us to do it. incentivizing is not going to help. But Donald Trump is more stuck on his idea of victory, not what the American need is for terms of strategic alliances, the ability to know that we have friends, stability, all these things, and also him and Rubio and all these guys, they don't understand. Also, I think the nature of humanity. What makes you think you could just bully people around? They really do think like if we just take their oil, they'll eventually give up. Like, well, that's necessarily not the case. Like maybe that's not a good plan. Maybe actually having other forms of dialogue and maybe trying to work things out are going to be better. Or at the same time, maybe not using U.S. military force for every, dumb idea this president gets in his head is also a policy we should probably be following.
There's a phrase that a Marine told me early in my career. It's a common phrase in the military. The enemy gets a vote.
Enemy always gets a vote.
And,
yes.
and that phrase has always stuck with me. And that it doesn't mean like, what people do in response is justified or like,
nope.
Hey, that's the way it is. But it does mean that like there will be consequences. If you use force and violence against whatever group it is for whatever aims, at some point there will be force and violence back. And
absolutely. This is from Marines to Clausewitz to Sun Tzu. They've all said the same thing, right?
Like
you can do whatever you want, but at the end of the day, the other side has a option, and the option sometimes is to engage also in violence. And when that happens, these things aren't theoretical, right? These are actual men and women on the ground. And I was one of those young men that had to execute some very scary orders sometimes, and it sucked. It's not great having to go into some very hostile situations, hostile cities. But someone was making a plan about this, and they thought this is a great idea. Yeah. But they're not the ones that have to execute it. They're not the ones that have to go do the scary stuff and deal with the scary consequences of it. And the enemy always gets a vote. And by the way, the more you do something, the more the enemy actually feels confident that they could also engage too. And I think that's the one thing that these guys don't understand. Like you got away with, thank God, because of our great skill of our men and women during this operation. Some of it also being luck, but the more you go in and do this, the more likelihood you are going to end up getting people killed, because there'll be more confidence that's built on the other side too. And that's when we have some real horrible situations. And you saw in the Iraq War, people, longer we were there, the Sunnis just got more comfortable. Somalia is another good example. The longer we were there, the Somali clans got more comfortable and confident in shooting us. So the same thing could happen very quickly in Venezuela.
You mentioned that he's stuck in 1987, which I think is very apt. I mean, even down to the fact that like a lot of the Venezuelan boat operation, where we're just blowing up ships with, I think, no actual legal justification, is like
murder. It's called murder. It's fine.
It's called murder. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is literally from a Tom Clancy novel. Like there's like actual Tom Clancy novels about this kind of thing, right? Covert operations to go after narco traffickers. But in terms of this as a kind of imperial gambit, it struck me that this is as much a 1925 play as a 2025 play. Like, and I want to talk about how you understand what the 21st century energy world looks like, because Trump is quite explicitly a roll back the clock. I mean, he says it. We want to bring back beautiful coal, right? He wants to take a fuel that is expensive, uneconomic, dirty, and being left behind for good reason, and revive it, like make everybody ride around in horse and buggies, basically. He's obsessed with expanding oil production. But if you look out into the future, into 10, 15, 20, 45 years, the share of things powered by these fossil fuels is going to go down. And the big question for America right now is that we are in the midst of an enormous energy transition that happens maybe once in a lifetime.
Right.
And there's a real absence, I think, of political leadership to talk about it. It's something that you've really taken on and thought a lot about. How are you thinking about what American energy leadership looks like right now?
Well, I mean, American energy leadership in terms of us is to making sure that we continue moving to diversify as much as possible our energy. It doesn't mean that we're going to, automatically phase out, carbon-based energy, because it's not possible. But the thing that's happening right now that this president is doing incorrectly is he's trying to roll back, to an era and time of energy production that is extremely inefficient and extremely expensive. And what this means, Chris, is that it's going to end up being even more expensive for us to fix this later, right? when, again, this president is gone and coal is extremely, extremely expensive, hard to maintain, and getting smaller and smaller supply. We're going to have to go and now retrofit, generators and or any type of adding new generation that we should have years ago. That's going to cost us billions and billions of dollars. Instead of trying to reduce our need for oil, especially to run vehicles, we're going to have to continue to maintain this infrastructure that can be diversified and bring down the cost both for those people that are still using traditional gasoline and those for bringing they're using electric vehicles. And again, that time, the longer you put it off, the more expensive it gets. When you have the opportunity to build very fast, very quickly, renewable energy to put, literally electrons, onto the grid within months to be able to meet the demand, whether it's from, the very controversial data centers or homes or chip plants. You could be doing that and planning for that and actually making sure that we have a growing economy that has stable energy for all those that need it, whether it's private business, whether it's, homes or anything like that. We need to do that now because you could create that stability, or if not, you're going to have this backwards energy grid that's essentially based on off 1920, 1930 technology that's not going to really lead us into the future, right? If we can really have a forward-looking energy plan, we will own the American future. If we're going back and focusing on energy and only energy that is, antiquated, then we will not be moving. We will go back to the future of what Donald Trump wants. And that's not a great future. It's not a great future. And it's not that he's trying to stop things. He literally is taking apart things, right?
Yeah. I mean, they're blocking
windmills,
stuff yes.
Offshore windmills, all these things where people actually were actively working on it. And he
90% complete, I think, in Connecticut.
Exactly. And turning around and stopping them just because he wants to, number one, own the liberals. That's a big thing for him and his people. But number two, he truly does believe that somehow will only encourage more people to move to coal. What it is going to encourage more people to do is to spend more money for inefficient energy. And at some point, once energy becomes too expensive in this country, you will lose jobs. People will take their factory jobs to other parts of the country. People will spend less because they're spending more on energy, and that affects this whole economy altogether. So if we want to win the American future, let's have the energy policy of the future. And that's not what this president has. This president has some weird throwback that makes him feel good of what he thought the country was gazillion years ago and not where we want to go as a country.
So I want to, you mentioned that about phasing out carbon fuels, which you said was not possible, which I think is possible, just depends on the time horizon, right?
Timing, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, right. So, but I just want to put a pin in that for a second because you can't talk about any of this without climate, but I want to actually put climate to the side for a second because one of the things that I think is so striking about this conversation, having covered climate and energy now for 2 decades, is that in the last few years, this remarkable inversion has happened. For a long period of time, progressives, had to argue that you needed to restrict carbon output, and fundamentally you're making a restriction argument about energy.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And also investing in clean energy, right? But the economics weren't scanning such that solar needed subsidies and you wanted to tax carbon because you wanted to get the prices right in the long term.
Right.
This incredible thing has happened in the last years.
It's amazing, yes.
In 2025, in the first year of the Trump administration, which is launching a full assault in every conceivable way on clean energy, it's still the case that the majority of new grid energy added was clean, carbon-free energy.
Right. And Chris, the other thing to remember, it's not only clean and affordable, it's quick. And
Say more about that.
Well, so we have growing energy demand now. A good example, in Arizona, we actually had population growth, but we didn't actually have energy demand growth at the same time because we were better about conservation. We were building better houses.
Mm-hmm.
We became, more insulated houses, everything else like that. Now you actually see energy growth increasing, demand increasing in Arizona. And so we had to produce more. If we want to produce more to keep up with demand, the thing that is the most competitive and that is actually the cheapest English my second language, renewables. right? Being able to put a solar field together is going to be faster than putting down the infrastructure pipeline of a gas trip or gas generator. And same with, if you want to retrofit or keep open some coal power plants, they're more expensive, and you have to truck in the coal. You have to make sure you still have that coal mine nearby, or else you're even trucking it further and costing more. And so right now we are going to skip this innovative technology that is cheap, affordable, flexible, and can be quickly put on demand, as demand is going to be increasing sometimes exponentially in some areas. So for all these like AI buddies of the president, they need to be telling him like, hey, we need data centers. And at some point, if we can't build enough, data centers fast enough with enough energy to back it, we're going to go looking somewhere else, and whatever other country gets the benefit. Changing the rules and regulations about how you could like put renewables down and where you can move renewables would be the best thing that could happen for that sector, or for people, in I would say in working class areas that need to have reliable, affordable energy. Being able to have your local utilities, or state-run utilities, whatever it is, to be able to put down quickly whatever renewable is available in that area, will end up saving money. And this is all about costs. And if you can bring down the cost of anything, you are more popular and you can end up winning elections. I think this president just doesn't care at some point. He just wants us to go back to the 1930s.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think with him, it genuinely is an ideological fixation. Like he just believes he loves carbon energy. I like out of nostalgia. But I mean, partly he's very tight with the oil industry, but it almost isn't even rational. And as we've seen in Venezuela,
I mean, look, even nuclear. Like I'm a very big supporter of nuclear, and hopefully that we have even more innovations when it comes to nuclear power, whether it's small modular reactors,
right,
or moving to fusion reaction, which I think would be,
incredible,
groundbreaking, obviously.
Yeah.
But this president, member, grew up around 3 Mile Island, and he still has like some very advocative views even on nuclear.
Yeah.
And it's all because, in the 1970s, whatever, 3 Mile Island, it made an informative impression on him, and he just can't, get it out of his head.
In terms of the renewable situation, the cost situation, so you were talking a little bit about, we've got more demand now. It has sort of flatlined. We've got more demand now, and there's a few things driving that. A huge part is AI data centers.
Yep.
I should not say a huge part. It's still a relatively small slice of the pie overall.
It's one of the many things that are driving it. Yeah.
The other thing is, as we move to electrify everything, right, we need more and more from the grid. So like, for instance, I've moved to heat pumps. I'm driving an electric car, right? And we're moving things off of fossil fuel onto the grid. The grid needs to produce more power. So I want you to tell me, what is the story you want to tell to constituents, to Arizonans who are concerned about electricity prices? I watched the midterm elections. It was very striking to me that in both the gubernatorial election in Virginia and in New Jersey, electricity and energy prices were a huge issue. They smack you in the face to anyone that pays their electricity bill. They are going up. This is not anecdotal. The data shows it. Right. They're going to continue to go up. There's a kind of right-wing story to tell, which is... And
you have no choice but to pay it, by the way. That's the other thing people don't understand.
Yeah, you can't shop around.
Yeah, you can't shop around. You're paying this.
Yeah. So there's a right-wing story that I think, Jack Ciattarelli tried to tell in New Jersey, which is like the woke busybody libs have mucked with the system enough to drive up your energy prices. And then I think there's a kind of progressive version, which is, we need to build new green energy so that we have the energy of the future that's cheap and accessible and affordable. Right. And also these big tech companies are screwing you with their data centers. Basically, that's the argument, right? What is your story when people come to you and say, why is electricity spiking?
Well, why there's higher demand and there's not enough investment in creating it fast enough now. And this administration has cut all capability for us to actually put energy on the grid as fast as possible, and especially cheap energy, quick energy, which is renewable energy. And, again, if you start talking to it from a perspective of, cost first, I think you open up a lot more conversations with people. Now, Arizona's a red state, as you know, there's 300,000 more Republicans. But when we talk about energy, we actually do emphasize in Arizona renewables and how good they can be for the economy of Arizona, to power Arizona. And we talk about the need for data centers to also have reliable power that they are providing and that they're paying for, and not at the cost of the ratepayer. So centering first of all the voter, the citizen, the customer matters the most, because I think, from my sense, especially in the 2024 election, people, in ideal situations, people are always going to want to be greener, but in most situations, because people are dealing, with paycheck to paycheck, they just want steady energy. When you could explain to them
cheap
that
energy, steady cheap energy,
steady cheap energy. Thank you. Yeah, steady cheap energy. But when you explain to them, like, you can have steady cheap energy if we have a good investment in renewables and batteries, to back up. And when you remind them about that, and as a matter of fact, it's the quickest way to do it, then people are more understanding, because you're not just doing this from an ideological position. Like, you're not trying to be moralistic. Like, we need to be greener. Like, we need to be cheaper and stable, and we had the added benefit of being greener. And I think that's a approach that works in Arizona. I can't speak for everybody else, but I think it works for that. And the other thing is, let's remind people, some of the biggest producers of renewable energies right now are in red states.
Oh yeah,
you go
Texas,
to Iowa, Texas, the Midwest in general. Some of the biggest producers of renewable energies right now, largely wind and solar, are from these red states. So there clearly is important to have in your energy mix. This doesn't have to be ideological. We can build the economy of tomorrow, win the future of America, and have stable, reliable energy that is clean, that we can use to really power our future.
There's also the regulatory question. You mentioned it before, and maybe we can take a little time with it. I just listened to a great podcast with the great David Roberts, who I think at the Volts podcast.
Yep, I spoke.
You spoke to him
like 2 weeks ago. Yeah,
exactly. And he's he's incredible, and I learned so much from that podcast. It tends to be very wonky and technical, but he had one of the big gurus of Australian rooftop solar on. And one of the things you hear about Australia is, for a bunch of complicated reasons, partly having to do with a federal law they passed to standardize approval. You basically can call up a rooftop solar place and get rooftop solar 3 days later, quite literally.
Yeah.
Now, I just went through rooftop solar here in New York City. I put on rooftop solar, and it was 2 to 3 months.
Oh wow, that's a lot. That's a lot of time. That's not what it is in Arizona either.
Yeah. So tell me, a big part of this story too is, particularly for something like rooftop solar, is just making it as bureaucratically streamlined, right? Regulatorily streamlined for people to do the right thing.
Well, look, not to diminish rooftop solar. Rooftop solar obviously has its position in terms of energy production, but full, solar generation to actually bring the kilowatts and the megawatts you need for
industrial, yes, you need industrial size,
or huge houses actually has to happen in open areas. And here's where we messed up. So, for example, Arizona is 65% federal land. With a good percentage of that being Native American land. Some of the best places for us to put a bunch of, solar panels down is on federal land. In order for us to actually get a permit for someone to buy and then build on these federal lands, you're going to have to go through a huge and long, expensive EIS and a NEPA process. And a lot of times these solar companies just want to be able to put up as fast as possible and, start generating. That helps them get investments. That helps keeps, the ROI high enough for investors to keep doing this. And so what ends up happening is that we have less solar than places, we generate less solar than places like Texas, even though we are the sunniest state in the country. Right.
And that's purely just because you have so much federal land that it's harder to install it. Yeah.
Yeah. And now it doesn't mean that we have to skip all process. No, because you want to make sure you're not endangering, very, cherished land, culturally, significant land that's very important for the environment, things of that nature. But there also has to be a quicker and smarter way for us to determine maybe this flat piece of land, BLM land usually, just west of areas of the, Metro Phoenix, is actually better suited to build solar plants than it is to just be an empty field. And a lot of times, if you start driving ever west of Arizona, west of Maricopa County, you will see vast. I'm talking hundreds of thousand acres of just vast empty land that is beautiful in some sense, but largely can also be very beneficial in terms of solar. It takes too long to do that. And now you have another problem adding with the current president right now. There is nobody that there is no company, investment fund, or anything else like that is going to want to also invest in solar or renewables at a large scale when this president can arbitrarily just take and yank your investment away. So we have it on one end where we have created this regulatory burden that has made it more difficult in some regards to make renewable energy faster, efficient, and cheaper than carbon. And now you're creating another uncertainty with this guy who just will pull something if he doesn't like it, right? And so it's a horrible combination of bad incentives for private investment, which we're going to need. This can't all be done with government investment. You want private investment to really scale up energy and fix it. Now, the third thing that we talk about is transmission. And this is very important because you're going to hear Republicans talk about hey, we're for permitting reform. You know what? As long as you treat gas pipelines the same as you treat solar panels, we're fine. You could put your solar panels up as fast as possible as long as we get to put our gas pipeline up as fast as possible too, or in as fast as possible too. But what they're trying to do is do a fast one on all of us, where they don't want to bring permanent reform to transmission. Why does that matter? Because if we can have renewables moving quickly and efficiently across the grid, they become a lot more economic, which means, the energy that is being created potentially in Arizona can move across the grid to, for example, Idaho or other parts of the country that could actually use that energy. We see that kind of happening right now also in a very inefficient way. In Arizona, we sometimes see California solar producers dump their excess energy onto the Arizona market, which then creates a problem with our own solar market because now we're essentially being undercut. And so there's actually no longer any incentive in Arizona right now for us to kind of be building more. Now, if we had the ability to quickly move our electrons across the country, now you're creating markets. Now you're creating stability, and now you're creating more incentives to happen. Not conservatives, but Republicans, I should say, especially those that are very much carbon focused, know that. And so they will talk about permitting reform. They will talk about being agnostic when it comes to energy agnostic, but they will always be against transmission and redoing our grid to make it smarter, being able to, put transmission up faster. Because if they do that, you're going to give a huge advantage to renewables because you'll be able to move them across the country because they're already cheaper than it is. And then if you're a person that's trying to buy energy in Arkansas, you don't care how it's being made. You just look at what the kilowatt per hour cost is. And if you see the kilowatt per hour cost is cheaper of something that's being produced in Arizona than something that's being produced in Louisiana, even though it's just south of you, you're going to buy the cheapest thing possible. And that puts carbon to a disadvantage.
That's a great point. I mean, and we should also note it's not just an abstract fairy tale that you can move these electrons. Like in China, they're basically doing it. They've built this enormous solar production in a very kind of sparsely populated part of the country that they're, they've run this sort of super transmission to power parts that are populated. Right. So this is not like
and you could do
sci-fi.
That too in Arizona too. I mean, you could do that all over the country. You could do, hydro. You could do geothermal in different parts of the country. You literally could be creating different pockets of energy and be efficiently moving them all across the country. And in some regards, and sometimes that might be carbon that ends up being more cheaper. It could be nuclear against cheaper, but unless you have that smart grid with easily implemented and installed transmission, you're not going to have an even playing field when it comes to the movement of our electrons.
Let's now come back to climate, because I'll put my cards on the table. For me, I've covered climate for most of my career. It's something I care very deeply about. I think it's kind of civilizational challenge of our time. I think I'm also agnostic about the political messaging. If you told me that the best way to achieve a carbon-free future was to never mention the climate, I would say, great. We don't have to talk about it. Like I truly don't care, right? I just care about the outcomes. And I'm also open to the idea that in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people are trying to make sure they could buy their kids sneakers. They make sure that they could pay the rent at the end of the month and pay the electricity bill. And they might say yes, I want a carbon-free future. I understand climate change is real. I understand it's threatening me. And also when I have to prioritize what I really care about and what I want to hear from a politician, it's low on the list. Fine. And I think that's probably true for the majority of voters. That said, where do you see climate in all of this? Because it does strike me that, like, yes, you have to lead with price, but it does feel incomplete to not talk about the pollution that the fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel is producing and what it does to the country.
I mean, that's the other thing. You talk about, you switch. You went from climate to pollution. Pollution, your everyday person understands. Climate, they kind of understand.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And pollution, you feel personally, versus climate is a problem.
Abstract,
but for a lot of people, it's a long-term thing. I think you can have a very logical conversation about, the need for us to divest or have a more diverse, energy mix that produces less pollution. I think it's also fine to talk about climate. Like, you just have to be realistic about how you're talking about it, right? And I think what we don't want to do is to promise something big that we are going to go 100%, renewable in 10 years in order for us to make sure that we don't increase, the world temperature by 1 or 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. That doesn't compute to working class person. Like, a working class person does care about the environment, I think also does care about climate change, but we have to communicate it properly. And we have to communicate how we can be winners in this too, how we can produce renewable energy that's going to end up bringing, pollution down and eventually brings climate change down without raising the costs of your utility bill. We can't just expect them to be idealistic because we're idealistic. We actually have to work with them. And it's, let's give them credit that they're willing to get there, but we also have to put the work in. And, if you look at some of the good examples, like, China right now is producing more and more, renewable energy.
Dude, it's crazy what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's insane.
They're turning downward in terms of their emissions. And in terms of what their footprint is, and their goals, we are slightly starting to tick back up, unfortunately, because of this presidency. If China can do it, we certainly can do it too. We can certainly do the manufacturing, the housing, the data centers using renewable energies, while also, dealing with the transition off carbon, and still having a growing economy. There's a lot more for us to be doing, and we can do it and still have everyone be winners, right? You could have the Wall Street world be winners. We have big companies now that invest in this. You could have our climate change advocates be winners, because you're seeing the downturn in terms of a carbon footprint. The consumer ends up winning because now their utility bill is cheaper, right? So, but being able to give them the respect and actually communicating that, I think, matters a lot for politicians.
And now I want to talk about data centers, because it was very striking to me that you're the person who held your seat, Kyrsten Sinema, who you announced a primary challenge for, and then she announced that she was, I think then she announced she's no longer a Democrat, and then she announced she's not running again. And that's the seat you now occupy. And she is now, one of the things she does for money is she's a lobbyist for AI firms trying to place data centers. There's footage of her at a local town meeting telling people why they needed to invite in this data center. A bunch of people at the town meeting being like, we don't want your data center. Right. I think the politics of this are really interesting. I think there's a real backlash brewing. I also understand arguments for why this frontier technology needs a lot of power and people want to push it. There's also really sort of horror story versions of it. For instance, the one that Musk has built in Tennessee seems, from all the reporting I've seen, to be like running off basically the dirtiest possible generators and like producing enormous amounts of pollution in like historically marginalized Black working class and poor communities. But what's your view on this, a U.S. senator? Like, and also, how much are you getting lobbied by the AI dudes? Like, are they in your office every day?
No, so they're not in my office every day, nor do they really have in my office much at all. I do think that we need to really understand and where the AI future goes on all sides of it, about how we interact with it as humans, right? Because, there's some really dangerous stuff that's happening that comes out of AI. How
Oh,
we
you mean the
interacted-
non-consensual pornography being produced on
non-consensual
Elon Musk's
pornography,
site?
AI chatbots that are encouraging people to have suicide. I mean, and just bad behavior. There's innovations that are going to be really good. We're going to be able to use AI to discover new cures, to bring more efficiency. That's not Doge style shit, but real efficiencies to government. We're going to be able to use them properly when properly done to help people with learning disabilities. There's so many things that are going to come out of this, and then we have to deal with the actual energy side of this. And I think the approach that my former colleague has taken, which is a data center is good anywhere, is incorrect. I also think the concept of no data centers being built is also incorrect, because I think that's not facing reality. But like anything else we've done in the past, we need to place these places where they're appropriate. Right, like they build data centers in Arizona right now because of our stupid laws in Arizona in the middle of neighborhoods. And it's just disgusting. And where we could be building some really good affordable housing, data centers are just coming in and building these data centers in the middle of these neighborhoods, because it's also the quickest way for them to get really affordable energy, because they're in the middle of an energy grid essentially, right?
Interesting.
But I think there should be every state, if not the state, then at some point the feds, but every state should come up with like proper zoning and proper plans for data centers, where they have to pay for their own energy, when they have to pay for their own upgrades if they have to do to the energy grid, where they're placed in areas that aren't valuable areas for residential neighborhoods, or in Arizona where it's water scarce, things of that nature. We have to find a balance to this. We have to find something that works for our future growth and innovation in that area, but also preserves standards of living, energy consumption. Why would an individual homeowner have to pay higher rates than the data center billionaires?
Yeah,
right?
That's crazy.
If they're being the bigger draw, then they should be paying more. You should not be treated in an equal amount. So I think that balance has to come. It has to come from leaders like myself and other ones, but certainly it has to get going. And I apologize, not believing you, but except I am going to the House floor now speaking in support of Tim Kaine's War Powers resolution.
Yes, I'm going to let you go because there's a war powers resolution that would require congressional authority for further military action in Venezuela. And I think also there's going to be a vote on Greenland and all that. So I'm going to let you go, Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.